There's a type of psychological strength that makes people deeply uncomfortable, not physical intimidation, not aggressive dominance. I'm talking about the kind of mental strength Jung developed through his confrontation with the unconscious. A mind so integrated, so conscious, so unshakable that it literally frightens people who encounter it. Why? Because a truly strong mind can't be manipulated, can't be gaslit, can't be pulled into collective delusions. It sees through projections, recognizes unconscious patterns, and remains centered while others spiral into chaos. This kind of strength doesn't attack. It simply refuses to participate in the unconscious games everyone else is playing. Jung discovered that building this mental strength isn't about becoming harder or colder. It's about becoming so psychologically complete that external forces can't find a foothold in your psyche. And I'm about to show you exactly how Jung built this kind of mind, and why most people will fear you when you develop it. Here's what Jung understood about mental weakness. It's not lack of intelligence or willpower. It's psychological fragmentation. Most people's minds are divided kingdoms, conscious fighting unconscious, persona battling shadow, ego warring with self. This internal division makes them controllable, predictable, and psychologically defenseless. Think about how easily most people are triggered, manipulated, thrown off center. One comment destroys their day. One rejection shatters their self-worth. One challenge to their beliefs sends them into existential crisis. They're not weak people, they're fragmented people, and fragmentation is vulnerability. Jung witnessed this throughout his career. The seemingly strongest people, successful executives, brilliant academics, powerful leaders, would crumble when their psychological fault lines were touched. Their strength was performance, not integration. Their power was external, not internal. Their minds were fortresses with the gates wide open. But Jung also encountered the opposite. Individuals who'd integrated their shadows, united their opposites, and achieved what he called psychological wholeness. These people were unbreakable, not because they were tough, but because they were complete. There were no splits to exploit, no unconscious buttons to push, no hidden weaknesses to manipulate. These integrated individuals terrified others, not through aggression, but through their immunity to psychological manipulation. They couldn't be guilt-tripped because they had integrated their shadow. They couldn't be gaslit because they trusted their perception. They couldn't be controlled because they were psychologically sovereign. Jung realized that true mental strength comes from integration, not fortification. You don't build walls around your mind. You unite all aspects of your psyche into an indivisible whole. And when you achieve this, you become psychologically dangerous to anyone invested in unconscious control. Jung's first principle of mental strength: integrate your shadow completely. Every rejected aspect of yourself is a door through which you can be manipulated. Close those doors by reclaiming what you've disowned, and you become psychologically impenetrable. Your shadow contains everything you've labeled bad and pushed into unconscious darkness. Your anger, selfishness, sexuality, aggression, vulnerability. But here's what Jung discovered. These aren't weaknesses to hide. They're powers you've rejected. And as long as they remain unconscious, others can use them against you. When someone triggers your shadow, they control you. Call someone with rejected anger aggressive, and they'll bend over backwards to prove they're peaceful. Accuse someone with disowned selfishness of being selfish, and they'll sacrifice themselves to demonstrate otherwise. The shadow is your remote control, and everyone can see the buttons except you. But when you integrate your shadow, when you consciously own your anger, selfishness, darkness, something remarkable happens. The buttons stop working. Someone calls you selfish. Yes, I have the capacity for selfishness, and I use it appropriately. Someone says you're aggressive. When necessary, absolutely. The manipulation fails because there's nothing unconscious to hook. Jung demonstrated this personally. Colleagues would try to shame him for his unscientific interest in mysticism. Because he'd integrated this shadow aspect, he'd simply agree, yes, I explore beyond conventional science. The attack would fall flat. There was no unconscious material to trigger, no hidden shame to exploit. One of Jung's patients, a woman who'd been emotionally manipulated for years, transformed through shadow work. She integrated her rejected anger, her disowned power, her suppressed sexuality. Her manipulative partner's tactics stopped working overnight. Not because she fought back, but because there were no longer any unconscious levers to pull. This is what scares people. When you've integrated your shadow, you can't be controlled through shame, guilt, or fear. You've made friends with your darkness, so no one can threaten you with it. You've accepted your whole self, so no one can use parts of you against you. The integrated shadow doesn't make you dark, it makes you complete. And completion is terrifying to those who depend on others' fragmentation for control. Building this strength starts with radical honesty. What parts of yourself do you reject? What triggers you most in others? What accusations make you defensive? These are your shadow aspects begging for integration. Reclaim them, and you reclaim the power others have over you. Jung's second key to unbreakable mental strength. Develop the ability to hold opposite truths simultaneously without choosing sides. This capacity, what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, makes you psychologically unmanipulatable because you can't be forced into false binaries. Most people's minds collapse under paradox. They need things to be either or, black or white, good or bad. This binary thinking makes them controllable. Force them to choose sides, and you control their position. Create false dilemmas, and you dictate their options. Present reality as either or, and you limit their responses. But Jung discovered that reality is both and. Light and dark coexist. Good contains evil. Evil contains good. Strength includes vulnerability. Vulnerability includes strength. The mind that can hold these paradoxes without resolving them into false simplicity becomes uncontrollable through conventional means. This isn't relativism or indecision. It's the capacity to contain complexity without fragmenting. When someone tries to force you into either-or thinking, you respond with both and awareness. When they present false dilemmas, you see third options. When they demand you choose sides, you transcend the division. Jung developed this capacity through his confrontation with the unconscious. He had to hold the tension between his scientific training and mystical experiences, between rationality and irrationality, between sanity and madness. Lesser minds would have chosen one side and rejected the other. Jung held both until something greater emerged. One of Jung's most brilliant analysands mastered this principle. In every situation, she could hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. When others fought over who was right, she could see how everyone was both right and wrong. When groups demanded loyalty to one position, she maintained connection to truth beyond positions. This made her terrifying in discussions, not because she argued better, but because she couldn't be cornered into defending false positions. She'd acknowledge truth wherever it appeared, even in opponents' arguments. She'd admit limitations in her own perspective while maintaining her stance. She was psychologically unsiegeable. This is what Jung meant by an unbreakable mind, not rigid but flexible, not certain but capable of containing uncertainty, not position-dependent but truth-oriented. When you can hold opposites without fragmenting, you become immune to the divide-and-conquer tactics that control most minds. People fear this capacity because it makes you unpredictable and uncontrollable. You can't be manipulated through false choices because you see beyond them. You can't be trapped in ideological boxes because you recognize their limitations. You can't be controlled through polarization because you don't polarize. Building this strength requires practicing what Jung called holding the tension. When faced with either-or choices, ask, what if both are true? When pushed to take sides, explore, what transcends these sides? When presented with contradictions, wonder, how might these both be aspects of a larger truth? Jung's third principle of mental strength. Become so conscious of projection that others' projections can't touch you. When you understand that most of what people say about you is actually about them, their opinions lose all power over your psychological state. Projection is unconscious autobiography. When someone attacks you, they're usually describing their own shadow. When they judge you, they're revealing their own rejected aspects. When they tell you who you are, they're actually confessing who they are. Once you see this clearly, others' projections become information about them, not you. Jung discovered this through brutal personal experience. Freud projected his own father complex onto Jung. Colleagues projected their shadow material onto his work. Patients projected their unconscious contents onto him constantly. At first, these projections affected him. Then he realized none of it was actually about him. This realization creates extraordinary mental strength. Criticism stops hurting when you recognize it as the critic's self-portrait. Attacks stop landing when you see them as the attacker's shadow confession. Judgments stop mattering when you understand them as the judge's unconscious material seeking a screen. But here's what makes this strength terrifying to others. When projections don't stick to you, they bounce back to the projector. The person attacking you suddenly feels their own attack. The one judging you experiences their own judgment. The projection returns to sender, and they're forced to face what they were trying to avoid. One of Jung's students developed this immunity completely. In meetings where others would attack her ideas, she'd calmly respond, "That's interesting. What in you is reacting so strongly?" She wouldn't defend or counterattack. She'd simply mirror back the projection's source. The attackers would become confused, agitated, often apologizing without understanding why. She'd become a psychological mirror, not absorbing projections, but reflecting them. This made her terrifying to anyone unconsciously trying to avoid themselves. Being around her forced people to encounter their own shadows because she wouldn't carry their projections for them. This is the strength that scares people most, the inability to be used as a projection screen. Most human interaction is mutual projection. I'll carry your shadow if you carry mine. When you stop participating, the whole unconscious economy collapses. People either have to become conscious or avoid you entirely. Jung called this withdrawal of projections, but it's really immunity to them. You're not withdrawing your projections, though that's important too. You're refusing to accept others. You're saying, that belongs to you, not me. I won't carry your unconscious material. Building this immunity requires constant vigilance. When triggered, ask, Is this mine or theirs? When attacked, wonder, what are they confessing about themselves? When judged, consider, what shadow material are they projecting? Soon, others' opinions become psychological data about them, not verdicts about you. Jung's fourth key to mental strength sounds paradoxical. Embrace conscious suffering, not masochism or victim consciousness, but the strength that comes from voluntarily facing what others spend their lives avoiding. This creates a mind that can't be threatened because it's already faced everything threatening. Most people organize their entire lives around avoiding suffering. They'll betray themselves, abandon their truth, sacrifice their integrity, anything to avoid psychological pain. This avoidance makes them controllable. Threaten them with suffering and they'll comply. Promise to remove suffering and they'll obey. But Jung discovered that consciously chosen suffering, facing your fears, integrating your shadow, confronting hard truths, creates invincibility. Not because you become immune to suffering, but because you're no longer controlled by the threat of it. You've already been there, voluntarily, and survived. Jung's descent into the unconscious was voluntary suffering. He could have stayed safely in his successful career, but he chose to face psychological territories that might have destroyed him. That voluntary confrontation with potential annihilation made him psychologically fearless. What could anyone threaten him with that he hadn't already faced? This principle transforms everything. When you voluntarily faced rejection, the threat of rejection loses power. When you've consciously experienced failure, the fear of failure dissolves. When you've deliberately confronted your worst fears, fear itself becomes just another experience, not a controller. One of Jung's patients, a man paralyzed by fear of poverty, deliberately put himself through voluntary poverty for 6 months. He lived with absolute minimum, faced every fear about money, experienced what he'd spent his life avoiding. When he returned to normal life, he was psychologically transformed. He could no longer be controlled through financial fear. Employers couldn't threaten him with job loss. He'd already survived poverty. Society couldn't manipulate him through status anxiety. He'd already been at the bottom. The economic fears that control most people had no power over him because he'd consciously faced them. This is what terrifies others, someone who can't be controlled through fear of suffering. You can't threaten someone who's voluntarily faced their worst fears. You can't manipulate someone who's consciously experienced what they were avoiding. You can't control someone who's transformed suffering from enemy into teacher. Jung emphasized this isn't about seeking suffering or becoming indifferent to it. It's about consciously facing the specific suffering you've been avoiding, integrating the experiences you've been resisting, voluntarily confronting what involuntarily controls you. Building this strength means identifying your greatest fear and moving toward it consciously, not recklessly, but deliberately. Face in small doses what you've been avoiding in totality. Integrate gradually what you've been rejecting completely. Transform suffering from unconscious tyrant to conscious teacher. Jung's ultimate principle of mental strength. Achieve complete psychological sovereignty. This means your psyche becomes self-governing, self-determining, immune to colonization by others' thoughts, beliefs, or emotions. You become a psychological nation-state with secure borders and clear autonomy. Most people are psychologically colonized. Their minds are occupied territories filled with others' opinions, beliefs, judgments. They don't think their own thoughts. They think inherited thoughts. They don't feel their own emotions. They feel contagious emotions. They're not living their own lives, they're living scripted lives. Jung discovered that true mental strength comes from psychological decolonization, clearing your psyche of foreign material and establishing self-governance. This doesn't mean isolation or narcissism. It means clear boundaries between self and other conscious choice about what enters your psychological space. The sovereign mind asks of every thought, is this mine or implanted? Of every belief, did I choose this or inherit it? Of every emotion, am I feeling this or catching it? Of every desire, do I want this or was I programmed to want it? This constant discrimination builds impenetrable psychological boundaries. Jung achieved this sovereignty through his break with Freud. He had to separate his own thoughts from Freud's theories, his own path from Freud's expectations, his own truth from Freud's authority. It was Psychological Independence Day, declaring sovereignty from the colonizing force of his mentor's influence. This sovereignty is what truly scares people. A sovereign mind can't be influenced by groupthink, can't be swayed by emotional contagion, can't be controlled by social pressure. It stands alone when necessary, thinks independently always, remains centered while others lose themselves in collective currents. One of Jung's most individuated patients described it perfectly. I feel like I finally own my own mind. Others' thoughts can visit, but they can't move in. Others' emotions can be witnessed, but not absorbed. Others' expectations can be considered, but not obeyed. I'm psychologically self-governing for the first time. This made her terrifying to those who depended on psychological merger. Family members who'd always emotionally enmeshed couldn't penetrate her boundaries. Colleagues who relied on groupthink couldn't pull her into collective unconsciousness. Friends who needed emotional validation couldn't make her responsible for their feelings. Building this sovereignty requires what Jung called psychological hygiene, constantly cleaning your psyche of foreign material. Daily practice of distinguishing self from not self. Regular audits of beliefs, thoughts, emotions to identify what's authentically yours versus what's been implanted or absorbed. The sovereign mind isn't closed, it's selective, not isolated but self-determined, not narcissistic but self-possessed. It can engage with others without merging, connect without enmeshing, relate without losing itself. This is the ultimate strength, being so psychologically self-possessed that you can't be possessed by anything else. Jung's blueprint for building a mind so strong it scares people isn't about aggression or dominance. It's about integration so complete that you become psychologically ungovernable. Integrate your shadow completely. No unconscious material for others to manipulate. Hold opposites without fragmenting. Immunity to false binaries and forced choices. Become projection-proof. Others' unconscious material can't stick to you. Embrace conscious suffering, no longer controllable through fear. Achieve psychological sovereignty. Your mind becomes self-governing territory. These aren't separate strengths, but aspects of one development, psychological individuation. When you become whole, integrated, conscious, and sovereign, you naturally become terrifying to those who depend on others' fragmentation, unconsciousness, and psychological colonization. This strength doesn't make you cruel or cold. It makes you incorruptible, not aggressive but unassailable, not attacking but unattackable. You become dangerous not through what you might do, but through what can't be done to you. Here's what Jung wants you to understand. The mind that scares people isn't the violent mind or the brilliant mind. It's the integrated mind, the mind that can't be manipulated, controlled, or colonized. The mind that sees through projections, holds paradoxes, and remains sovereign in a world of psychological chaos. This strength is available to anyone willing to do the work of integration, not the external work of achievement, but the internal work of shadow integration, consciousness development, and psychological sovereignty. It's harder than building physical strength or intellectual capability because it requires facing everything you've avoided. But once built, this mental strength is unbreakable, not rigid, flexible, not hard, whole, not defended, integrated. You become psychologically dangerous not through aggression, but through consciousness. Others fear you not for what you might do to them, but for what you might show them about themselves. Start with the shadows you've rejected. They contain your hidden strength. Notice the projections you receive. They reveal others' unconscious material. Embrace the suffering you've been avoiding. It contains your freedom. Claim psychological sovereignty. Make your mind your own territory. People will fear this strength because it represents everything they've sacrificed for false security, their wholeness for acceptance, their truth for belonging, their sovereignty for safety. Your integrated mind becomes a mirror, showing them their fragmentation, and that reflection is terrifying. But here's the secret. The people who fear your psychological strength are revealing they need you to remain weak for their worldview to survive. Your fragmentation validates their own. Your unconsciousness justifies theirs. Your colonization normalizes theirs. Build the mind Jung describes, integrated, conscious, sovereign, and yes, it will scare people. Good. That fear is the sound of unconscious patterns breaking, projections failing, and false realities crumbling. Your strength doesn't destroy others, it destroys illusions. And for those invested in illusions, that's the most terrifying strength of all. If you're ready to build the kind of mental strength that comes from psychological integration, subscribe to this channel where I decode Jung's deepest insights about shadow work and individuation. Watch the video on your screen now about integrating your shadow, the foundation of unbreakable psychological strength. Remember, a mind so strong it scares people isn't built through force. It's built through integration. And that journey starts the moment you stop rejecting parts of yourself and start reclaiming your psychological wholeness.